Bog ponds and shoreline bogs are two variations of bogs which, along with fens, are part of a larger wetland grouping called peatlands. Bogs form where conditions promote the accumulation of large amounts of organic material called peat. A variation on a peatland, not really a bog, is called a fen. Fens exist when peatland gets much of its water supply from mineral-rich groundwater that modifies the acidity of the peat mass and increases the level of decomposer activity. Fens look like bogs, but are dominated by different kinds of wetland plants, including graminoids. From the time 12,000 years ago, when glaciers left a raw Adirondack landscape, bogs and other peatlands, like fens, have slowly formed in open water bodies. We think the first plants to colonize the edges of these acid open water bodies after the glaciers receded were shrubs like leatherleaf, sweet gale, and sheep laurel. As the roots intertwined, sphagnum moss, also called peat moss, grew amongst the shrubs. Peat mosses are the big accumulators of organic material in bogs, while woody plants form the protective matrix. As the organic material grows in height above the water table, other plants, including the trees tamarack or black spruce, are able to survive in the bog. When we visit a bog, we see vegetation zones that reflect the age of parts of the bog. The oldest parts of the bog support tall black spruce and tamarack. Next oldest is the zone with taller shrubs and low trees. The youngest parts are those with low shrubs and moss. These vegetation zones occur in rings or bands, with the youngest toward the center of a bog with a bog pond, and toward the water's edge of the bog on a shoreline bog. The oldest vegetation occurs at the upland edge of both a bog pond and a shoreline bog. The simplest expression of a bog is a round depression in the landscape, often called a kettle hole, where the plant vegetation zones are regular and concentric. Here, factors that lead to bog formation are consistent throughout the water body. Conditions required for bog formation include stagnant water and a lack of decomposers. Stagnant water is defined as still water that is not oxygenated. Decomposers are factors which oppose peat formation, including moving water, mineral-rich water, and oxygenated water. In the Adirondacks, with its abundant rainfall, cold temperatures, acid bedrock, and acid soils, there are many opportunities to have good conditions for bog and fen formation. A bog is an interwoven and intertwined mat of many species of bog plants. At the leading edge of the bog, where it intersects an open water body, the bog mat may be cantilevered into the pond. Further back from the edge, the roots of trees and woody debris may help support the cantilevered section of bog mat. The parts of a bog that are most isolated from flowing water are the most acid. The acidity found there is from chemical activity of sphagnum moss and acid rain. Ground or surface water flows reduce this acidity. If the outer edges of a bog or peatland are influenced by ground or flowing water, the highest acidity will be away from such influence. When we talk about a basin holding a vast deposit of peat, we know that peat there accumulated very slowly over very long periods of time, even geologic in time scale. Peat deposits have told us much about natural history, preserving pollen and other macrofossils, including mastodons and ancient human remains, for thousands of years. Because peat takes so long to form, game trails used consistently by deer and moose to move through a bog are ingrained into the surface and easy to spot from the air. Within a single bog, chemical conditions can vary, creating vegetation patterns visible from the air. Variation may be due to the relative influence or lack of influence of surface water, groundwater, and precipitation. In shoreline bogs, particularly those near large meandering rivers, we see such patterns. Where these features are prominent, as we see here, we call them pattern bogs or pattern fens. In our videos, we see the impact of flowing water and changes in the pattern of vegetation. Decreased peat accumulation occurs where inlets flow into water bodies, alongside meandering rivers or streams, and in larger water bodies where impact of wave action from prevailing winds prevents or erodes peat accumulation. All of these variables lead to patterns in bog and fen vegetation and along the bog or fen edge at open water shorelines. But often the landscape is more complex. Flowing water can erode and move peat off-site, or it can introduce minerals or oxygen that leads to decomposition and decrease in peat accumulation. Chemical conditions in water that promote peat accumulation in bogs are things like low pH or acid conditions, cold temperatures, high concentrations of organic acids, high concentrations of heavy metals, especially iron and manganese, dark stained water, and anoxic or very low oxygen conditions. Tall trees, often white pine, may appear to be on bogs since the surface plants or ground cover is the same combination of sphagnum mosses and bog shrubs as elsewhere in the bog, but these trees are rooted in mineral soils or glacial deposits concealed beneath the bog in order to withstand windstorms. Here we see a conifer swamp in an alluvial river corridor, probably with mineral soil deposits, upstream of a pond that has deep-water marsh characteristics. This is an example of a pond that looks like a bog pond with shoreline bogs, but it is probably on mineral soils and not on peat. Alongside the meandering St. Regis River, we see a large bog that comes close to the river corridor, and at first glance, looks like a shoreline bog. It is actually a bog formed in its own terrain depression, separate from the alluvial river corridor. The patterns of vegetation we see on the Adirondack landscape reflects both the good conditions for bog formation and those conditions which reduce accumulation of peat, the decomposers. Extreme climate events, like windstorms or floods, are examples of catastrophes that might rapidly impact a bog. Wildfire, dam building by beaver or humans, and insect infestations are other catastrophic impacts that will rapidly interrupt the glacial pace of bog development.